In 1999, a Marvel executive offered Sony the film rights to nearly its entire superhero library. Iron Man, Thor, Black Panther, Ant-Man, all of it, for $25 million. Sony's own people looked at that offer and said no. They told their bosses nobody cared about any Marvel character except one, and sent them back to negotiate a smaller deal for just Spider-Man alone. That single decision is why an entire cinematic universe worth over $22 billion in box office ended up being built by somebody else, while Sony walked away paying just $7 million for the one hero everybody actually wanted. This is the story of the worst great deal in movie history, and somehow, nobody involved was actually wrong to make it. To understand how a decision this consequential got made this casually, you have to understand exactly how desperate Marvel was in the room where it happened. This wasn't a confident media company negotiating from strength. Marvel had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1996, and the comic book industry itself was in genuine freefall around it. The early 90s had been a speculator's bubble, variant covers, foil-embossed gimmick issues, an entire generation of buyers treating comics as investment commodities rather than stories worth reading twice, and when that bubble popped, it took the entire distribution network down with it. Roughly 3/4 of the comic shops operating in the early 90s had shut down by the time the decade ended. Marvel wasn't selling off movie rights because it was building a long-term strategy. It was selling because it needed cash to survive at all, and in 1998, freshly emerged from bankruptcy, that need was still urgent. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because Spider-Man's film rights had already been through a legal nightmare before Sony ever entered the picture, and that history is exactly why Marvel was in a position to sell anything by 1999 in the first place. Back in 1985, a company called Canon Films bought the rights for a mere $225,000. From there, things fell apart in ways that read less like a business deal and more like a courtroom farce. The rights bounced between Canon's successor company, Carolco, and Viacom, with James Cameron, yes, that James Cameron, actually attached to write and direct at one point. A project whose budget ballooned from $15 million to $50 before collapsing entirely under the weight of the very ownership disputes it was caught in the middle of. Canon's parent company filed for bankruptcy of its own in 1994, and MGM bought up its film library, immediately claiming that purchase entitled it to permanent Spider-Man film rights. A judge disagreed in 1995, ruling the original rights had already expired. And then came the detail that actually saved Marvel's entire future relationship with the character. A Marvel lawyer discovered Canon had never properly registered its original sale with the US Copyright Office. That single clerical failure, sitting quietly ignored for years, is the reason the rights reverted back to Marvel at all, right as the company needed something valuable to sell. It's worth sitting with how differently this entire story could have played out. If that registration had been filed correctly, or if that lawyer hadn't caught it, Spider-Man could easily have ended up as a forgotten, tangled-up property permanently stuck in someone else's abandoned film library instead of the character that eventually anchored one of the highest-grossing franchises in movie history. Before we get to the part of this story audiences actually remember, it's worth hitting subscribe if you're the type who likes finding out just how close this franchise came to never existing the way we know it, because that's basically the entire premise of this channel. So by 1998, Marvel finally had clean, sellable rights again, and it needed money immediately. That's when Ike Perlmutter, running Marvel at the time, made contact with Sony Pictures executive Yair Lando. who was specifically hunting for Spider-Man's big screen rights. Perlmutter's counteroffer wasn't a modest one. He offered Sony access to essentially the entire Marvel character catalog: Iron Man, Thor, Black Panther, Ant-Man, and more, characters that had no film presence anywhere yet, for $25 million total. Landau brought that offer back to Sony's leadership. According to accounts later published in Ben Fritz's book on the era, the response was blunt. Nobody at Sony believed any of those other characters mattered. Go back, they said, and make a deal for Spider-Man specifically. Sit with what that decision actually cost Sony over the following 25 years, because it's almost impossible to calculate cleanly. Every one of the characters dismissed in that room became a cornerstone of a shared universe that has since grossed over $22 billion worldwide. Sony didn't just pass on a licensing deal. It passed on the opportunity to be the studio building the Avengers, and it did so because, at the time, the assessment wasn't unreasonable. Superhero cinema hadn't proven itself yet, and the most recent evidence available to that room was actively discouraging. Batman and Robin had landed in theaters just 2 years earlier, in 1997. And it hadn't just underperformed, it had become an industry punchline, widely blamed for freezing the entire genre's commercial credibility until X-Men thawed it out again in 2000. Superman was dormant with nothing viable in active production. Nobody in that room was being foolish by the standards of 1999. They were reading a genuinely bleak recent track record correctly, and the market was about to change in ways nobody sitting in that meeting could have reasonably predicted. What Sony actually walked away with, once negotiations narrowed to Spider-Man alone, was a deal that looks almost comically lopsided in hindsight. $7 million for exclusive film production and distribution rights, with Marvel retaining a 5% cut of box office gross per film, plus a share of merchandising profits. Sony didn't buy Spider-Man outright either, which is the detail most casual retellings of this story skip entirely. The rights only stayed valuable and stayed with Sony as long as new films kept getting made within a defined window. Spider-Man wasn't property in the traditional sense. It was more like a lease that would quietly expire the moment Sony stopped actively using it. A structural detail that would end up mattering enormously decades later, because it meant Sony could never simply sit on the character the way a studio might shelve a less urgent property. Every few years, whether the timing was creatively ideal or not, Sony was under real pressure to put a new Spider-Man film into production, purely to keep the rights from reverting. Once Sony actually committed to Spider-Man alone, the studio moved fast. Sam Raimi got locked in as director, Tobey Maguire as the lead, and the 2002 film became the first movie in history to cross $100 million in a single opening weekend, eventually grossing $821 million worldwide. Between Raimi's original trilogy and the later Andrew Garfield films, Sony's pre-shared universe Spider-Man movies combined for roughly $3.95 billion in worldwide box office off a single $7 million acquisition made during a fire sale. Marvel's percentage of that gross, plus its merchandising slice, suddenly looked like one of the worst trades in modern entertainment history. Except Marvel wasn't actually losing by the standard it needed to survive by in 1999. It needed cash immediately, and the deal delivered exactly that. At a moment when the alternative wasn't holding out for a better offer, it was potentially not making it to the next fiscal year at all. And it's worth pausing here, because this wasn't happening to Spider-Man in isolation. Marvel spent this exact same desperate stretch licensing out nearly everything it owned, just to keep the lights on. Iron Man's film rights went to New Line Cinema, where they sat undeveloped for years before eventually lapsing back to Marvel with no movie ever made. The Hulk went to Universal, which released a 2003 film that underperformed badly enough to cast doubt on the character's box office viability for years afterward. The X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and eventually Daredevil all went to 20th Century Fox, where the results were far more mixed than Spider-Man's run, genuine hits, alongside outright disasters, with Fantastic Four in particular struggling across multiple attempts to find an audience. Every one of those deals ran on similar logic: get cash now, worry about creative control later, because later wasn't guaranteed to exist. Spider-Man's story just happens to be the most dramatic example, both because Sony came within one meeting of owning nearly everything else too, and because, unlike almost every other character Marvel licensed away in this period, Spider-Man is the one that actually worked, consistently, for over 2 decades straight. The part of this story that actually explains where things stand today isn't the original sale though. It's what happened after Disney bought Marvel in 2009, because that's when the lease structure Sony had been operating under for a decade finally started mattering in a completely different way. Around 2011, Marvel and Disney moved decisively into the part of the business that compounds over time far beyond any single opening weekend: merchandising, toys, apparel, video game licensing, theme park integration, the long tail of revenue that keeps paying out for years after a movie leaves theaters, sometimes outlasting the film itself in total value. Sony kept its film and distribution rights. Disney and Marvel took over consumer products licensing almost entirely. In exchange, Sony bought out Disney's prior participation in film profits, a trade that simplified Sony's financial exposure in the short term, while quietly giving up the exact cushion that merchandising had always provided. At the time, that trade-off made sense for both sides. Sony wasn't built to run a global toy and licensing operation the way Disney already was, with theme parks, retail partnerships, and decades of consumer products infrastructure already in place. But it meant Sony was now carrying a character it could only keep by continuing to make movies with it, while collecting less of the total ecosystem around those movies than almost any other studio holding a comparable franchise. That structural pressure is exactly what set up the deal fans actually remember. Sony and Marvel Studios agreeing in 2015 to share Spider-Man inside the MCU itself, with Kevin Feige co-producing and Tom Holland stepping into the role starting with Civil War. That agreement wasn't Marvel buying the character back, and it's worth being precise about what actually happened instead of what fans often assume happened. Sony still held the film and distribution rights, still greenlit the solo films, and still collected the overwhelming majority of box office revenue on them. What changed was creative integration. Spider-Man could finally exist inside the same shared continuity as Iron Man and Captain America, appear in ensemble Avengers films, and have his own solo movies shaped with direct input from the architect of the wider universe. Something the original 1999 deal's structure had made essentially impossible for over 15 years, because that deal never anticipated a shared cinematic universe existing in the first place. Nobody negotiating in 1999 could have designed around a concept that didn't exist yet. The 2015 arrangement was less a correction of the original deal and more an entirely new structure grafted onto it, built to solve a problem the original contract had no language for. It's the reason No Way Home could exist at all, and it's the exact same underlying framework Brand New Day is still operating inside of right now. One studio owning distribution and the lion's share of revenue. another studio supplying the creative connective tissue to the rest of this universe. That arrangement hasn't always been smooth, either. In 2019, reports surfaced of a real public dispute between Disney and Sony over how to structure the financial terms of continuing that partnership, centered on how much Disney would contribute to financing future films versus how much of the revenue and creative control it would receive in return. For a genuinely tense stretch, it looked like Spider-Man might exit the shared universe entirely, with reports at the time suggesting Kevin Feige himself might step back from producing the character's future films. Fan backlash was immediate and loud enough to become a story in its own right, and within weeks, a revised agreement quietly kept the collaboration alive. It's a useful reminder that this entire relationship, 25 years after that original $7 million handshake, is still being renegotiated in pieces behind closed doors, not permanently settled the way fans sometimes assume once a deal gets announced and the headlines move on. That instability is also exactly why nobody outside the two companies can say with certainty how long this current arrangement holds. Brand New Day exists because the post-2019 deal is still active, but Sony has never disguised its own ambitions to keep building an expanded universe of its own around Spider-Man's supporting cast and villains, a separate, complicated project running in parallel to whatever role the character continues to play inside Doomsday and Secret Wars. Two studios, one character, two competing long-term visions, all traceable back to a single afternoon in 1999 when nobody in the room thought they were making a decision that would still matter a quarter century later. So here's the actual answer to why this deal makes no sense. And it's not the answer most retellings land on. It's not that Marvel got fleeced, and it's not that Sony got lucky. Both sides made a defensible, rational call given what the entertainment industry actually looked like in 1999, before superhero cinema had proven it could sustain a repeatable, universe-spanning business model. Perlmutter needed cash his company might not survive without. Landau's team needed a character audiences would actually pay to see, and by every metric available to them at the time, Spider-Man was that character, and the other 20 were an unproven gamble stacked on top of an already uncertain bet. What makes no sense isn't either side's math. It's what that single, reasonable decision accidentally built afterward, a 25-year custody arrangement so structurally strange that it survived a near total collapse of the superhero genre, a corporate bankruptcy, a change of ownership, a public billion-dollar dispute, and at least one direct threat to pull the character out of the shared universe entirely, and somehow never actually broke. That's really the detail worth sitting with longest. Most licensing deals this old either get bought out entirely or quietly fade into irrelevance. This one kept mutating instead, reshaped by bankruptcy court, reshaped again by Disney's acquisition, reshaped a third time by a public fight in 2019. And it's still actively being renegotiated in the background right now, years after most fans assumed the Sony-Marvel relationship had been permanently settled. Every Spider-Man movie you've watched since 2002, whether it starred Maguire, Garfield, or Holland, exists because of decisions made in rooms most fans never think about, over numbers that look almost absurd next to what the character actually turned out to be worth. Subscribe,